February 18, 1943. The North African desert shimmered under a merciless sun, every grain of sand burning like glass. Heat waves rippled over the dunes, distorting the horizon into a trembling mirage of gold and white. A lone column of vehicles crawled through the emptiness. Dust-coated panzers, trucks sagging under the weight of empty fuel cans, and soldiers whose eyes had long forgotten the color of shade. At the head of the convoy, Colonel Hans Meyer of the Afrika Korps wiped sweat from his brow and stared through sand-stained binoculars. Somewhere ahead, beyond that dancing line of heat, lay what his men called salvation. An American supply dump rumored to hold more fuel than his regiment had seen in a month. The colonel lowered the glasses and exhaled, his voice rasping through cracked lips. "They bring everything to the desert," he muttered. "Fuel, chocolate, even refrigerators." His driver smirked, not sure if it was a joke or a complaint. In the distance, engines coughed and sputtered. The Afrika Korps was running on fumes. Meyer's tanks, once the terror of North Africa, had become steel skeletons trapped in an endless sea of sand. He remembered the early days, the dash across Libya, the victories that made Rommel a legend. Back then, German columns rolled like thunder, and Allied troops fled before them. But now, 2 years into the Desert War, everything had changed. Supply lines stretched thin, convoys bombed by British planes, and Italian ships sunk before they reached Tunis. The desert wasn't an ally anymore. It was a slow, patient killer. In the camp the night before, one of Meyer's sergeants had made a bitter joke. "The Americans waste more fuel in 1 week than we get in a month." The laughter that followed wasn't real. It was dry, like sand grinding against metal. Everyone knew the truth. The U.S. Army, new to the desert, was rich in everything but experience. They brought too much fuel, trucks, canned meat, even ice cream makers. To the exhausted Germans, that kind of abundance was more insulting than defeat. The colonel kicked at the sand. His boots left shallow prints that the wind erased almost instantly. He had orders from Rommel's staff: a small reconnaissance raid to locate and, if possible, seize Allied fuel reserves near Kasserine. But this raid was more like a suicide mission. His panzers were running on their last liters. Even if they reached the American depot, they might not have enough to return. Still, the desert didn't forgive hesitation. If they didn't take fuel, they'd die where they stood. A radio operator called out. Herr Oberst, intercepted American chatter again. Something about new convoys arriving from Tebessa. Meyer nodded slowly. The Americans were pushing deeper into Tunisia, trying to build momentum after their first clashes with the Germans. They thought the Afrika Korps was finished. He intended to remind them otherwise. By noon, the wind had risen. It carried fine dust that got into everything: mouths, rifles, engine vents. The men wrapped scarves around their faces. Inside his command car, Meyer studied the map. His fingers traced a thin pencil line through the mountain passes of Kasserine, where reports said U.S. supply trucks gathered before pushing forward. The irony was cruel. The Germans were hunting for American fuel to fight Americans who were trying to use that same fuel to fight Germans. "Colonel," said Lieutenant Weber, his second in command, "if this intelligence is wrong, we'll run out before we even reach them." Meyer gave a half-smile, tired and sharp. "If it's wrong, we won't have to worry about it. The desert will take care of us." They pressed on. The engines growled, the smell of burning oil heavy in the air. Every jolt over the dunes felt like a blow to the ribs. Over the radio, fragments of Rommel's voice crackled, orders, encouragements, warnings about American reinforcements. But the colonel barely listened. His focus was on the horizon, where a faint glimmer of metal flashed under the afternoon sun. Through his binoculars, he saw shapes: fuel drums, trucks, and tents. The American supply dump. It was massive, even from miles away. Rows of gleaming barrels sat in the open, stacked like gold coins. Trucks lined with tarpaulins, mechanics working without cover, soldiers laughing beside their vehicles. The colonel felt a mix of disbelief and rage. They didn't even bother to hide it. To the Germans, fuel was life. To the Americans, it was background noise. They had so much they didn't care if the whole desert saw. He whispered, "They call this war?" The driver turned. "Sir." "Nothing," Meyer said. just thinking how the rich never understand hunger. He stepped out of the car, boots crunching against gravel. The air shimmered like molten glass. He could smell gasoline even from here, sweet, intoxicating, maddening. His men gathered around, faces hollow and burned by wind. "This," he said, pointing toward the distant depot, "is what they fight with. Not courage, not training. Gasoline, food, radios. They drown in it." Someone laughed nervously. Another spat in the sand. Meyer raised his voice. "Tonight we move. No headlights, no engines after dusk. We glide down the dunes in neutral. Every drop counts." The men nodded, knowing the danger. One mistake, one flicker of light, and Allied planes would find them. But their desperation was heavier than fear. As night fell, the desert changed. The heat faded into freezing air, and the stars glowed like ice shards. The convoy crept forward, engines murmuring like ghosts. Each tank moved with careful rhythm, treads whispering through the sand. The silence was almost holy, broken only by the distant drone of an American aircraft somewhere beyond the hills. Inside his turret, Meyer lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. The glow illuminated the lines on his face, the exhaustion of years. He thought about the irony of it all. The Reich, master of Europe, reduced to scavenging fuel like beggars. The colonel wasn't a fanatic. He had seen too much to believe in slogans anymore. What drove him now wasn't ideology. It was survival, and the faint, stubborn pride of a soldier who refused to die standing still. At midnight they stopped. Ahead lay the valley that hid the American supply dump. From the ridge, Meyer could see faint campfires and headlights. Trucks rolled lazily between rows of barrels. He took out his binoculars one last time. The fuel shimmered in moonlight, silent and endless. He couldn't help but grin. Behind him, one of his men whispered, "Sir, there's enough fuel there to run our division for a month." Meyer nodded. "Then we'll take a month's life in one night." A gust of wind carried the scent of gasoline stronger now. It was maddeningly close, almost like perfume. The colonel closed his eyes and listened. The ticking of engines cooling, the soft grind of sand under boots, the quiet hum of the desert. He felt the weight of history pressing on him. This raid might change nothing in the grand scope of war, or it might change everything. A single captured depot could turn the tide for Rommel's retreating army, at least for a little while. As he crouched in the dark, the irony wasn't lost on him. Somewhere in Washington, American generals were probably boasting about their unstoppable production power. Somewhere in Berlin, bureaucrats were arguing over fuel allocations. And here, in the middle of nowhere, a single German colonel was about to gamble everything to steal what others took for granted. He looked at his watch, 0300 hours. The moon hung low, pale and sharp. He whispered to his men, "No noise until the first shot." In the silence that followed, he felt the absurdity of it all. A handful of dying machines, crawling toward an ocean of fuel guarded by a nation that didn't yet understand its own strength. The thought made him almost laugh. If they succeeded, the headlines in Berlin would call it a triumph. If they failed, no one would even remember their names. The colonel drew a deep breath, the smell of desert and oil mixing in his lungs. He looked once more at the shimmering barrels in the valley and murmured, "For one night, we will remind them who we are." The desert wind answered with a low moan, carrying sand across the tanks like a whisper of ghosts. The joke had been that the Americans wasted fuel while the Germans starved for it. But tonight, that insult would turn into something far darker. The laughter of yesterday would soon be drowned by the roar of engines. And by sunrise, the desert itself would decide who it truly favored. A fuel dump so big, it could have changed the whole war. One German officer against the impossible desert. What happens when desperation meets American abundance? The night was colder than they expected. The desert, which burned their skin by day, now bit through their uniforms with icy fingers. The stars were so bright they seemed to hum, and every sound, the creak of a track, the click of a rifle safety, echoed like thunder in the stillness. Colonel Hans Meyer crouched beside his lead panzer, Gloved hands pressed to the cold steel. The fuel gauge needle quivered near empty. His convoy had made it across the dunes, but barely. Behind him, a dozen armored vehicles waited, engines off, silent and dark. Each one was a dying beast that could roar only once more. The plan was simple on paper, impossible in practice. At dawn, they would glide down into the wadi and seize the American supply dump before the enemy could respond. Intelligence suggested light guards, mostly engineers and transport drivers. But the colonel had been in the desert too long to trust light resistance. He'd seen how fast the Americans could summon tanks and planes when cornered. A mechanic approached, face hidden beneath a scarf. "Herr Oberst," he said quietly. "Panzer Dre and Funf have broken fan belts. If we move them, they'll overheat within an hour." "Then they don't move," Meyer replied. "Strip them. Fuel, guns, radios, everything." The men worked in near silence. Tools clicked. Belts snapped loose. Boots crunched on gravel. They were professionals, but exhaustion had made them slow. Some hadn't eaten properly in 2 days. Their rations were thin, hardtack, dry sausage, bitter coffee that tasted like dirt. Meyer watched them and felt something heavy in his chest. Not pity, exactly, but a kind of grim admiration. They were still here, still following orders, even when they knew how hopeless it all was. He turned his eyes toward the horizon. A faint glow showed where the American camp burned through the night. They had floodlights, electricity, music even. Sometimes the wind carried faint notes of jazz or swing music across the sand. To the Germans, it was almost surreal, a war fought to a soundtrack. The Americans were new to this theater, but they brought a piece of their world with them, oblivious to how strange it looked from across the desert. Just before dawn, a runner stumbled up from the forward scouts. "Herr Oberst," he whispered. "We've found their perimeter. 3 machine gun posts. No armor, just trucks. Maybe a dozen sentries awake. Any patrols?" "Not for the last hour." Meyer nodded slowly. He pulled his map from his jacket, spread it across the hood of the car, and traced a finger across the ink. "We attack from the west ridge. Use the morning sun to blind them. We must hit fast and load faster. No heroics. Every drum we take is worth more than a medal." The lieutenant beside him, Weber, shifted uneasily. "If their air patrol spots us, we'll be sitting ducks." "They won't," Meyer said. "We'll be gone before they know what hit them." The words were confident, but inside he wasn't sure. The Luftwaffe no longer owned the skies. The Americans flew P-40s and A-20 bombers day and night, and the Afrika Korps had learned the hard way how fast fortune could turn when the sun rose. At 0400 they began the descent. Engines whispered in neutral, tracks grinding softly over sand. It was like sliding down the throat of some vast, waiting beast. The men breathed through their teeth, eyes wide, scanning the darkness for movement. One wrong sound, one flare, and it would all be over. Halfway down the ridge, a tank coughed. A sharp metallic choke. Everyone froze. Meyer held up a hand, pulse hammering. The driver swore under his breath and twisted the ignition again. The machine groaned but stayed silent. The column resumed, slower now. When they reached the bottom, the colonel motioned for the men to spread out. The camp was less than a mile away. Through his binoculars, he could see outlines of trucks and tents, soldiers asleep by the fires. A few guards walked lazily between the rows, rifles slung loose. There were hundreds of barrels, stacked in neat grids, gleaming faintly under the moonlight. Gasoline, oil, water, enough to fuel a division for weeks. Meyer whispered, "They don't even realize they're sitting on victory." Weber crouched beside him. "If we take it all, Rommel could move again. Or at least die with dignity," Meyer replied. They crept forward, shadows among shadows. Every step felt heavier. One soldier slipped on loose gravel and went down hard, his rifle clattering against a rock. The sound cracked through the night like a whip. Instantly, the camp stirred. A voice shouted in English. Then another. A flashlight beam cut across the sand. "Now!" Meyer roared. Engines roared to life, shredding the silence. Panzer cannons barked, sending shells into the first line of trucks. Explosions lit the valley in orange flame. American soldiers scrambled, shouting, some firing wildly into the darkness. Machine guns opened from both sides, tracers streaking across the night. The desert turned into chaos. The colonel's tank surged forward, crushing supply crates under its treads. He could feel the vibration through his boots. His gunner fired again, hitting a cluster of barrels. A fireball erupted skyward, the shockwaves slamming through the sand like a tidal wave. "Secure the western side," Meyer shouted into his radio. "Get the trucks loaded." Men ran through the smoke, filling jerry cans, tossing them into captured vehicles. The smell of gasoline was overwhelming, sweet, sharp, almost intoxicating. Some barrels were riddled with bullets, spilling liquid gold into the dirt. Meyer grabbed a hose and helped siphon it into the tanks himself. There was no time for hierarchy now. Every second mattered. From behind the ridge, muzzle flashes flared. The Americans had regrouped. Bullets whined overhead. A truck exploded in a bloom of orange and black. One of Meyer's men was thrown backward, body twisting in midair. The colonel didn't flinch. He had seen too many die to stop for one more. Over the radio, Weber's voice cracked with static. "We've got enough for half the vehicles, sir. But the Yanks are bringing up reinforcements." "Keep loading," Meyer barked. 5 more minutes. The dawn was coming fast, painting the sky with streaks of crimson and gray. It was beautiful in a cruel way, the kind of beauty only soldiers could see in the middle of madness. Suddenly, a voice came through the radio in English. "German unit, this is the U.S. 1st Armored Division. Surrender your vehicles or you will be destroyed." Meyer laughed bitterly. "Tell them we're just borrowing their gas," he said. Then came the rumble, a sound every man feared. Airplanes. The low, distant hum that grew until the ground itself vibrated. He looked up and saw dark silhouettes crossing the rising sun. American bombers. His time was running out. "Load what you can," he shouted. "We leave now." Engines roared as trucks filled with fuel began to pull away. Some men jumped onto the running boards, others clung to the sides. A shell exploded near the edge of the dump, sending barrels tumbling like dice. Flames rolled across the sand, licking at the tires of escaping vehicles. Meyer climbed onto his own tank, the metal searing under his hands. The heat was unbearable now. Smoke stung his eyes, but even as the camp burned, he saw his men hauling away the prize. Liquid power, salvation in motion. He looked back one last time. The American depot was a storm of fire and chaos. Soldiers ran in panic, trucks overturned, fuel roaring skyward in violent fountains. The colonel felt no triumph, only a strange calm. The mission had succeeded, but at a cost no one would understand. As his tank rolled toward the open desert, the wind carried the smell of burning oil and flesh. Behind them, the horizon glowed like a dying sun. They had won if winning still meant anything in a place like this. But Meyer couldn't shake the question clawing at his mind. They had stolen a month's worth of life in a single night. But how long before the desert or fate demanded it back? The radio crackled again, faint and broken. A voice asked for orders, but Meyer didn't answer. He was staring east, toward the growing light, wondering if salvation ever truly existed in war, or if it was just another mirage. The first rays of dawn broke over the dunes like the opening of a furnace, the sun rising red through the haze of smoke. The air stank of gasoline and burnt rubber. Colonel Hans Meyer wiped the soot from his face and stared back at the inferno they'd left behind. The American fuel depot was a smoldering ruin now. Black columns of fire climbing into the sky, barrels bursting like volcanoes. The raid had worked, but barely. Of the 15 vehicles that had started with him, only 8 were still moving. The rest were twisted metal, half buried in sand. Yet inside every surviving truck, sloshing in the metal drums, was more gasoline than he'd dared to hope for. The desert stretched out in all directions, cruelly silent. The engines rumbled softly, their tanks full for the first time in months. For a moment, the men forgot they were retreating, forgotten by Berlin, surrounded by enemies. For a moment they felt powerful again. "Colonel," Lieutenant Weber called over the roar of an engine. "We counted nearly 50 barrels secure. Enough to reach Rommel's line at Spitla." Meyer nodded, his face unreadable. "Then we move. Fast. Before the Americans regroup." They began their escape through the dunes, driving with no formation, no pretense of discipline, just survival. The sun rose higher, turning the sand white and blinding. In the rearview mirror, Meyer could still see the fire, a black scar on the horizon. Hours later, they stopped to refuel and regroup. The men staggered out of their vehicles, faces streaked with ash and sweat. Some cheered softly. Others simply sat in the sand, too tired to feel anything. A few filled canteens from the melted ice inside captured American coolers. Tasted of smoke and victory. Weber handed Meyer a pair of binoculars. "American pursuit is coming, sir. Scouts report armored cars heading this way from the south." Meyer looked through the lenses and saw the dust trail, wide, fast-moving, deliberate. The Americans weren't just angry. They were organized. "Then we won't outrun them," Meyer said. "We'll outlast them." He ordered his men to split up, dispersing across the dunes. Half the trucks would continue toward Spitla with the captured fuel. The rest would hold the Americans long enough for the others to escape. He knew what that meant. Some would never be seen again. When Weber protested, Meyer cut him off. "We're soldiers, not smugglers. Someone has to make sure the fuel gets there." By mid-morning, the Americans arrived. Jeeps, half-tracks, and light tanks appeared like ghosts out of the heat shimmer. Dust and sunlight turned them into golden specters. The Germans opened fire from behind low ridges, the crack of rifles swallowed by the roar of engines. The air filled with the smell of cordite and burning sand. Meyer's Panzer fired the first shell, hitting a jeep square in the center. The explosion tossed it into the air like a toy. The men cheered, but only briefly. The Americans returned fire with overwhelming speed. Shells struck the dunes, throwing up fountains of sand. The ground trembled. For an hour, the battle raged in waves. German machine guns raked the open desert while American tanks advanced methodically, one flank at a time. The sun climbed mercilessly overhead, turning metal so hot it seared skin through gloves. The men fought on, their mouths dry, their nerves frayed. Then came the sound that froze everyone, the low growl of aircraft engines. American P-40s swept over the battlefield, sunlight flashing off their wings. Bullets rained down, cutting through the sand like whips. One German truck exploded instantly, its fuel drums erupting into a pillar of fire that rolled across the battlefield. The heat was unbearable. Meyer shouted into his radio, his voice ragged. "Scatter! Scatter now!" Tanks turned sharply, throwing up dust, but the planes came again. 2 more explosions. One of his best gunners vanished in a storm of fire. Weber's voice crackled through the static. "They're everywhere, sir. We can't hold." The colonel gritted his teeth. He looked around and realized the truth. The desert wasn't just a battleground. It was a graveyard. Machines burned, men screamed, and fuel, the same fuel they'd risked everything for, was now killing them in waves of fire. He climbed out of his tank, the ground scorching beneath his boots. He watched the American planes banking in the sky, dropping their payloads with ruthless precision. And yet, beneath the chaos, he saw something extraordinary. His remaining trucks, the ones carrying the fuel, had slipped away, crawling north, hidden by the dust storm that the bombings had stirred up. The desert itself was covering their retreat. It was madness, but it was working. "Rommel will get his gasoline after all," Meyer muttered. By noon, the fight was over. The Americans, satisfied that the raiders were destroyed, withdrew to secure what remained of the depot. The desert fell silent again, littered with smoking wrecks and shattered men. Meyer pulled himself out from behind a sand dune, his uniform blackened, his face streaked with soot. He limped toward his surviving tank, one tread blown apart, the hull riddled with holes. The radio still hissed faintly. Weber's voice came through, weak but alive. "Sir, Some of us made it through. We're heading north. Trucks intact. 30 barrels safe. Meyer closed his eyes. Good. Keep moving. Don't stop for anything. He lowered the radio, breathing in the acrid scent of burnt oil. Around him, the battlefield glowed with dying fires. The victory was meaningless by normal standards. Half his men were gone, his tanks destroyed. But the mission, against all odds, had succeeded. They had struck the Americans, stolen their lifeblood, and delivered it to the front. He looked toward the horizon, where the dust of the escaping trucks had faded into the distance. That fuel would give Rommel's army a few more days of movement, maybe even one more counterattack. It wasn't enough to win the war, but it was enough to remind the Allies that the Afrika Korps wasn't finished yet. As he stood there, the desert wind whipped through the wreckage. It howled through twisted barrels and torn canvas, a mournful song of steel and smoke. The colonel could feel the heat on his face, the same heat that had devoured the American depot hours before. He picked up a handful of sand and let it run through his fingers. The grains were black now, stained with oil and blood. All this, he whispered, for gasoline. Behind him, one of the surviving soldiers limped closer. Sir, we can still make it to the ridge. There's water there. Meyer nodded absently. He wasn't thinking about water. He was thinking about how this raid, this desperate, reckless act, would echo through history as both triumph and tragedy. Later that evening, they found refuge behind a ridge of black basalt rock. The surviving men huddled together, drinking melted ice from a captured canteen. The colonel sat apart, staring at the horizon where the sun was bleeding out over the dunes. Weber's voice came faintly over the radio once more. We reached Rommel's line. The field marshal sends his compliments. He says your raid bought us a week. A week, that was all. Meyer exhaled slowly. The thought should have filled him with pride, but it only made him feel old. A week of life, paid for with blood and courage and luck. The colonel looked up at the stars appearing one by one. The same stars the Americans saw from their bases, the same stars that had watched Alexander and Napoleon march through this same unforgiving land. Empires came and went, but the desert remained. In that silence, he thought of the Americans who had died guarding their mountain of fuel. Young men, probably writing letters home the day before. They'd never understand what it felt like to fight with empty tanks and broken engines, to watch your army starve not from bullets but from the absence of liquid fire. The irony burned deeper than the sun ever could. Somewhere out there, beyond the dunes, his men were pouring stolen gasoline into German tanks. They'd move again for a little while. They'd fight again for a little while. And then the desert would take it all back. He smiled faintly, his face illuminated by the fading glow of the horizon. In that brief light, surrounded by ruin, Colonel Hans Meyer looked almost peaceful. The mission had been madness, but it had worked. The Afrika Korps had roared one last time. And for that fleeting dawn, the desert belonged to them again. By the time the smoke cleared over Kasserine, the desert had already swallowed the evidence. The wind erased the tracks, the dunes shifted again, and the wreckage sank into silence. Colonel Hans Meyer's raid became little more than rumor, an echo carried through Allied reports and German radio broadcasts. But among the soldiers who survived, the memory never faded. They had lived a miracle in a place that rarely allowed them. For one night, they'd stolen the lifeblood of the war itself and felt the pulse of power return to their machines. Yet as quickly as it came, it slipped away again, swallowed by the scale of history. Days later, the survivors limped back to the remnants of the Afrika Korps. The fuel they brought saved a handful of tanks and trucks, enough for one last thrust against the American lines. It wasn't victory, it was defiance. Rommel himself, weary and thin, met them at the edge of a broken airfield near Spitla. Dust swirled around him as he looked over the battered column, his face half hidden behind goggles. Meyer saluted stiffly, exhaustion in every movement. Your raid, Rommel said quietly, has bought us time. Not much, but enough to fight another week. A week, the colonel nodded, saying nothing. He knew what that meant. In the desert, time was measured not in days but in liters. A week of fuel meant a week of life. After that, the engines would die again, and the desert would reclaim everything. For the next few days, the Germans fought with renewed fury. The captured fuel powered their tanks through one last counterattack, catching the Americans by surprise at Thala. The Panzer IVs rolled again, black smoke streaming from their exhausts, guns blazing across the ridges. American Sherman tanks hesitated, unsure how the supposedly starving Afrika Korps still had strength to fight. For a few hours, the Germans looked like their old selves, swift, disciplined, terrifying. But the illusion couldn't last. Allied bombers found them again, and the same skies that had once been blue with Luftwaffe wings now belonged entirely to the enemy. Meyer's unit, running on the last drops of stolen gasoline, fought until the barrels ran dry. When the engines coughed their final breaths, the men abandoned the panzers and fought on foot, their boots sinking into the sand. The colonel watched the horizon where smoke rose from burning tanks, his and theirs, indistinguishable now. That night, Rommel ordered a retreat toward the coast. Tunisia was collapsing. The Americans had learned fast. Their logistics improved, their coordination sharpened. Supply dumps were now hidden, guarded, and spread across miles. There would be no more miracles like the one at Kasserine. The fuel Meyer had captured had been both a salvation and a requiem. When Meyer was finally captured weeks later, he looked nothing like the officer who had led that daring raid. His uniform was torn, his boots cracked. The British major who processed him looked at the thin man with curiosity. "You're the one who took our fuel at Kasserine, aren't you?" Meyer didn't answer at first. Then, after a long pause, he said quietly, "You had more fuel in one valley than we had in an entire campaign." The major frowned. "War's not fair." Meyer almost smiled. "It's not supposed to be. But it shouldn't be wasteful either." They sent him to a POW camp in Egypt, where he spent the rest of the war. In the evenings, he would sit under the open sky, staring at the same desert stars he had once followed into battle. Sometimes he thought about that night. The glow of burning barrels, the laughter of his men as they filled stolen tanks, the roar of engines in the darkness. It all felt like another life, as if the desert itself had been dreaming through them. Meanwhile, the war rolled onward without him. The Americans learned from every defeat. The logistical genius that had once seemed excessive now became unstoppable. Convoys stretched across the Atlantic, airfields sprouted overnight, fuel flowed like rivers through pipelines and depots. By 1944, when Allied armies stormed Normandy, their supply lines were a miracle of engineering. Each drop of fuel accounted for, protected, delivered on time. The lesson of North Africa had been carved into their doctrine. Wars are not won by courage alone, but by the steady, invisible machinery that feeds it. For the Germans, the opposite lesson came too late. Without oil, even the mightiest tank was just a coffin on treads. Without fuel, no blitzkrieg could move, no air force could fly. In the east, entire divisions froze where they stood, engines seized by cold and emptiness. The Reich that had once conquered continents was now stranded in its own arrogance. Years later, historians would argue about the meaning of Meyer's raid. Some called it reckless, a fool's gamble that changed nothing. Others saw it as a symbol of the Afrika Korps itself, brilliant, desperate, doomed. In one Allied report, an American colonel wrote, "The Germans fought like men who knew they had no future. Maybe that's why they fought so hard." What remained undeniable was the irony. The same Americans who had been mocked for abundance, for excess, had turned that abundance into a weapon no army on earth could match. The same Germans who once scoffed at luxury now envied the power of a full tank. Meyer had lived the difference firsthand. He'd seen courage ignite engines, but only fuel kept them burning. In his old age, long after the war, Meyer was interviewed by a young journalist. When asked what he remembered most about the desert, he didn't mention battles or medals. He said softly, "The silence after the engines stopped. You never forget that. It's the sound of everything ending." The journalist asked if he regretted the raid, the deaths it caused. Meyer shook his head. No, because it wasn't about victory anymore. It was about proving that men still mattered in a war of machines. We took their fuel, but they took our world. In the end, that's how wars are decided, not by who fights harder, but by who can keep moving. He looked out the window as he said it, watching cars on the street below. Machines powered by the same lifeblood that had determined the fate of empires. For a moment he smiled faintly. The engines hummed, steady and indifferent. The world had learned the lesson, even if it didn't know where it came from. The official histories of the North African campaign mention the raid in passing, a small note among grander battles. But for the men who lived it, it was everything. The night they stole back their strength, even for a heartbeat. The night when the desert burned brighter than the sun. And in the end, the same insult that had started it all came full circle. They had once mocked the Americans for wasting fuel. Now, as prisoners, they were fed by those same Americans, drinking their coffee, eating from their tins, transported in their trucks. The empire of scarcity had fallen to the empire of supply. Fuel, not flags, had decided the war. In one of his last letters before his death, Meyer wrote a single line that historians later quoted often. "We fought with courage, but they fought with engines. And engines never get tired." That was the final truth of the Afrika Korps Desert War. A campaign of brilliance defeated not by tactics, but by mathematics. The desert didn't care for bravery or banners. It cared only for what could endure its emptiness. And in the end, it was the side that could keep its engines running that conquered the sand. Amateurs talk tactics. Professionals talk logistics. General Omar Bradley's words would echo through every military academy in the decades to come. But for men like Meyer, they were not theory. They were memory, because long before Bradley said them, a German colonel had already lived them. In a sea of burning dunes, chasing the mirage of victory that smelled of gasoline and smoke. Which modern machine, he might have wondered, will repeat this story? This story is inspired by real events during the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, part of the North African campaign of World War II, when Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps faced the newly arrived U.S. II Corps under General Lloyd Fredendall. By early 1943, the German Afrika Korps was critically short of fuel, ammunition, and supplies. Allied control of the Mediterranean and relentless British and American air raids had cut off much of Rommel's supply line from Italy. German and Italian armored divisions were running on fumes, while American forces, though inexperienced, were backed by enormous logistical support from home. The Battle of Kasserine Pass, February 19 to 24, 1943, became the first major clash between U.S. and German forces in World War II. During this chaotic desert campaign, several German armored detachments launched desperate raids on U.S. supply dumps and fuel depots, seeking to capture vital resources. Allied accounts mention Afrika Korps units seizing fuel, food, and vehicles, sometimes more than their monthly ration in a single operation, before being driven back by counterattacks and Allied air superiority. While Colonel Hans Meyer in this narrative is a fictional composite character, his story represents real German officers who led such raids under near-impossible odds. In particular, Rommel's 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions made multiple surprise strikes on American supply lines around Spitla, Kasserine, and Tebessa, capturing thousands of gallons of Allied gasoline, briefly restoring their ability to maneuver before Allied forces regained control. Historically, Rommel's success at Kasserine Pass was short-lived. Though the Germans inflicted heavy losses and exposed America's inexperience, the raid only delayed the inevitable. Within weeks, Allied reinforcements, air power, and sheer supply dominance turned the tide. By May 1943, the Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia, marking the end of German control in North Africa. The moral of the story echoes real military truth. Wars are not only won by courage or tactics, they are won by logistics, supply, and endurance. The U.S. would go on to demonstrate unmatched industrial might, fueling the liberation of Europe and shaping the modern world.